Ms Engel, a letter in today's Herald signed by 12 leading third sector organisations in Scotland points to the real concern that there is among charities and civil Scotland about just how damaging the next round of welfare cuts will be. They're absolutely right to say that those least able to cope are likely to be hit the hardest. Today, MPs have an opportunity to strengthen the Scotland Bill so that it lives up to the recommendations of the Smith Commission in this section. This would enable us to shape a fairer future for Scotland's social security system and bring more of those welfare decisions and the levers to grow our economy into the hands of the Scottish Parliament. This Tory government has shown time and time again that they can't be trusted in social security, and they do seem utterly determined to press ahead with eye-watering further cuts of £12 billion. Scotland's charities are making clear today that the axe shouldn't be falling on those least well-off in our society, but should be shared in a more equitable way. At the last election, the SNP received an unprecedented mandate to speak up for Scotland, and today I'm asking... Ms Engel, I'm asking Westminster to listen and live up to the spirit and intent of the Smith Commission on welfare and deliver the powers we need to shape a social security system that supports and empowers people rather than punishing them when hard times hit. These amendments make that step in the right direction, and I hope the Government will accept them.
Sir Oliver Heald.
Madam Chairman, can I start by welcoming the huge transfer of welfare and tax powers which is in the bill, but I just wanted to make one point about conditionality, because over the years, the last 15 years or so, one of the insights which has struck in the field of work and pensions and welfare is that tackling poverty isn't just about benefits, it's about concentrating on helping people into work, it's about education and skills, and it's also about removing barriers to work. Now, conditionality is part of that process. It's something that was introduced by Labour, and what it's saying to the taxpayer and to the recipient of benefits is, look, if we pay huge amounts of money to train up a cadre of people in the job centres, if we hire in expert companies to give advice to people who are job seekers, if we involve the disability groups in the process too, then as taxpayers we're making a big investment in trying to help people into work and to end the dependency culture. Let me just finish the point. And so if the taxpayer's doing that, is it really right if somebody is offered an opportunity to go to the job centre for an advice session or to attend some training, they don't attend, they don't explain why, they're sanctioned, that we should then say, oh, that doesn't matter, that doesn't matter, the taxpayer can just pay the bill and there will be no consequences at all, because that is the effect of these two amendments that would take out the guts of Clause 22 and Clause 23 and remove conditionality. I give way.
For giving way. Does he not accept 2 points, however? 55% of the people who are in receipt of benefits are actually working. They don't need help into work. They're on benefits, they're doing the right thing, they're trying to look after the family, and they're the people who are going to be hurt by the reductions that the government are proposing. And secondly, whilst accepting that there does have to be a responsibility on those in receipt of benefits, the Select Committee of DWP, on 2 occasions, as was mentioned by the Honourable Lady, has said that the sanction regime is too fierce and needs to be adjusted. Does he not accept the Select Committee report?
Well, no, I served on the Select Committee for many years, and I do accept that it needs reviewing and that it needs to work properly. But that's not the same as scrapping it. And that would be the effect, to undermine it so severely, if these amendments were to go through, that it would be fatally damaged. And I just say to the honourable gentlemen and ladies opposite, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a wide transfer of powers or anything like that. I'm just saying, think about your taxpayers. Think about those people who are investing in job-seeking services, in all that help, and is it really right that there should be no conditionality? I give way.
Thank you, Honourable Member. In my constituency, during the campaign for this election, I met a man called Dave Grieve. He had gone along to the job centre and found very little support at all to help him get into employment. As a result, he took the initiative of setting up his own Facebook page. It now has 11,000 followers, and what he's doing is advertising jobs and promoting the opportunities that are not provided through your job centres.
Just say to the honourable gentleman that on the Select Committee we visited Scotland on occasions and we found... No, it's a UK-wide... We visited all parts of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, and we found some excellent services. So it may be that he has an example of a bad one, but overall, across this United Kingdom, and this includes Scotland, there are some excellent services. The taxpayers are paying for them, and I think these amendments undermine the conditionality that's very important to that. That's all.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Engel. I'm very pleased to have the chance to contribute to this debate. It seems to me that the Secretary of State, in responding to this part of the debate, needs to be very, very precise about his objection to the amendments that have been tabled in relation to a number of key principles. The first thing he will need to be very explicit about in rejecting the proposals that are being brought forward is whether he believes them to be at odds with and moving in the opposite direction from the intention of Smith. It seems to me that a number of these amendments seek to give better effect to Smith than the legislation currently before us achieves, and it's not an argument, therefore, about whether we share intention, but whether or not this legislation is adequate to the task. I hope the Secretary of State will bear that in mind in responding to this debate. The second thing that some of the amendments that I and my honourable friends, and indeed some of the SNP amendments, seek to achieve is to simplify the legislation. It is a little bit too complicated and hedged about with who's in and who's out of the provision of certain of the exceptions that appear, for example, in relation to definitions of disability, or too narrow in relation to definitions of carers. And I hope that the Secretary of State will be able to explain very precisely what his objections are to amendments that seek to make the legislation easier to give effect to and plainer in its intent. And the third thing, which I think is the substance of the debate that we've been having, which is to a degree a sideline debate. It's not actually a debate specifically about the legislation before us, but a debate about the intentions that we have for the welfare state. But I think the Secretary of State should acknowledge that what we're talking about is a welfare state that acts as an enabler of people, and where benefits enable people's full social participation, as for example carers benefits do, as for example benefits that enable disabled people to live decent and independent lives do, that there is no case for decrying those benefits on the basis that they create a dependency culture. They create a culture of dignity and participation, and I hope the Secretary of State will be able to distinguish between those two. Having said that, I don't think there is, certainly on the part of Labour members, a wish to say that there should not be a conditionality regime. We've always been a party that has accepted that in a conditional system you must have a backstop of sanctions where people willfully refuse to comply. Of course, the vast majority do not willfully refuse to comply. They get caught up in a completely baffling and increasingly unjust system. Yeah. And I think that the Right Honourable Member for North East Hertfordshire has rightly accepted that that system now needs to be reviewed, because it's clearly well beyond what any reasonable conditionality and sanctions regime should look like. But that isn't really the purpose of this legislation and the scope that this legislation and the debate that we're having is about. Ms Engel, I want to say just two or three very specific things in support of some of the remarks that have been made earlier on this afternoon. First of all, in relation to disability benefits, I do think that the way that Clause 19 has been written is actually going to cause quite a lot of confusion and dispute about who falls within the ambit of benefits that the Scottish Government can create or top up and who does not. For example, does the fact that somebody needs to be suffering significant adverse effects and unable to carry out day-to-day tasks exclude someone who perhaps suffers double incontinence? Arguably, that person should be within the ambit of the legislation, but why do we need to have any doubt? Does short-term mean that someone who is suffering a fatal illness but that fatality will occur within very short order, perhaps within a matter of 3 or 4 months. Is that person within the ambit of this legislation, or are they not? And it does seem to me that if we stuck with a much plainer description of disability benefits and who is eligible, then we would avoid a lot of unnecessary dispute and heartache, and actually might enable a Scottish Parliament to prescribe much more simply that certain conditions or circumstances would automatically give rise to an entitlement to benefit, as is the case in the UK legislation now. I think my honourable friend wants to intervene, and I'll be happy to give way.
Just on that very point, I think, would you agree with me that it is the case that as far as DLA or PIP is concerned, there is automatically entitlement there for patients who are terminally ill with less than 6 months to live, to automatically have that entitlement? And what is very stark is the contrast between those specificities and the vagueness which is before us today.
Well, indeed, that's an extremely good example. Those with terminal illness and less than 6 months to live are indeed automatically routed through and fast-tracked to eligibility for PIP. We could also talk about those on dialysis, who are automatically able to get the highest rate of double amputees, who are automatically able to get the higher rate of mobility, as are those with severe sight impairment. And I think it would be simpler if the Scottish Parliament could legislate to automatically route some of those people through to benefits, as is the case within the UK legislation now.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Is my honourable friend aware that there have been occasions cited by the Motor Neurone Disease Society where people who have had the DS 1500, the 6 months left to live assessment by a GP, have actually been challenged by the Department of Works and Pensions, which is so insulting as to be mind-boggling. And that's why we need very clear guidelines and definitions, which this is not doing.
Yes, I think it's insulting, it's obviously very, very distressing, and it's quite unjust. So I hope that the Secretary of State will look particularly at Amendment 128, which really seeks to bring that clarity to the legislation in relation to entitlement to disability benefits, and that he will be able to give us very clear reasons, if he's not able to accept that amendment, as to why not. In relation to carers, I recognise that the definitions that are encompassed in this legislation mirror the current entitlement to carers allowance. But as I think the Honourable Lady for Banff and Buchan was trying to explain, carers allowance is both a very useful benefit from the point of view of society as a whole. It's an enabling benefit also to enable people to provide care to their family and to their loved ones. And I think we should be very keen to ensure that we can extend those enabling benefits as far as is possible, and in alignment with, as the Honourable Lady rightly said, the landscape of social care and social support that's provided through our public services. And I don't think that it is creating a dependency culture, if the honourable members opposite will forgive me, to facilitate carers in their caring role. Indeed, I have to say, from a UK perspective, rather envious of this opportunity to look at the possibility of extending the definition of carers. And I hope again that the Secretary of State, if he feels he's not able to accept this amendment, will be able to explain very clearly why. The final thing I wanted to pick up on was in relation to Amendment 129, proposed by my honourable friend, the member for Nottingham North, who's not in the chamber at the moment. As I understand it, the effect of his Amendment 129 would not be to remove the provisions in relation to the consequences of someone having been sanctioned, but would mean that if, for example, someone had fallen out of the ambit of entitlement to housing benefit altogether, including, for example, because the operation of the bedroom tax meant that they were no longer able to have that housing benefit payment, that they would nonetheless be able to access a benefit that the Scottish Government might wish to introduce to meet that situation. Now, as my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh South West said, it is our intention to address that point in a later amendment which would devolve the whole of housing benefit. But I think, again, it's really important that we understand that Amendment 129 is not about trying to subvert the sanctions regime or the conditionality regime with all the flaws that that regime currently has. It is actually about trying to reopen access to support with housing costs to those who have fallen foul of a tax, a bedroom tax, which on this side of the House there is unity across parties in opposing. And I very much hope again that the Secretary of State will recognise that.
Minister Priti Patel.
Mrs Engel. Let me begin by saying that this has been a full debate on a range of important issues in which we know that there is a great deal of interest from both members of the House, from members of the Scottish Parliament and people throughout Scotland. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, has made clear on many occasions through the passing of the bill through the House, the Government is committed to implementing the Smith Commission agreement in full, and we believe the provisions of the bill do meet the spirit and the substance of the agreement. In responding to the proposed amendments, I will explain the Government's approach as I go through each section, but before I do so, I would like to reflect that this bill will give the Scottish Parliament very extensive new powers on welfare. The benefits for which the powers are being devolved last year accounted for £2.5 billion of spending, and that's around 1/4 of all welfare spending in Scotland outside the state pension. These clauses on welfare provide tremendous opportunities for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to design, implement and structure welfare in Scotland. This is a huge change and should not be underestimated. If the Scottish Government and the Scottish National Party want to spend more on welfare, they, of course, are able to do that. The consequence of the Smith Agreement is that in the future, the UK and the Scottish governments will be working together to provide welfare systems for people in Scotland, and we need to cooperate on doing that. Scotland's two governments already work well together and achieve a great deal, and I'm confident that this will continue as we seek to implement the devolution of these significant welfare powers. Now, turning now to the specific amendments, Mr. Chair, I will, of course, give way.
The Minister for giving way. This is now day three of the Scotland Bill, and thus far the Government have refused to accept any amendments. Now, the Devolution Committee, the House in the Scottish Parliament said this does not meet Smith. The House of Commons Library says it does not meet Smith. Will this Government now accept that they will accept some amendments? And can I say to the Honourable Lady, she better not even be thinking about amending this in the House of Lords, out of sight of democratic scrutiny by this House. And will she therefore assure me today that they will not be bringing forward amendments to the House of Lords, that will be done on the floor of the House of Commons?
What I say to the honourable gentleman is that, for a start, you actually heard the Secretary of State say this as well, that, you know, that it simply doesn't say that at all. But with regards to the amendments that we are debating today, I will go through the specific amendments that have been touched upon in the debate. But also, I think it's important that the honourable gentleman hears the points that I'm going to raise as well, to bring clarification. But also, in the course of the 3 days of debate, and we're only halfway through day 3, we've only just got started, in fact, I think the honourable gentleman should give the Government the benefit of the doubt and listen to the arguments that we are indeed about to advance. Now, turning now, Mrs Engel, to the specific amendments, Amendments 128 and 112 relate to disability benefits aspects of Clause 19. This clause, and specifically the interpretation provisions setting out what is meant by disability benefit, is intended to allow the Scottish Parliament to legislate in areas currently covered by the following benefits, and these are attendance allowance, disability living allowance, and PIP, personal independence payments. There are a number of common features to all of these disability benefits, and the key ones are that usually they are intended to help to contribute towards the additional costs that people with mental and physical health conditions or disabilities can incur. Second, they should primarily be directed at people with long-term physical or mental health conditions or disabilities rather than the conditions of a transient nature. Thirdly, that disability is by reference to the significant effects or needs arising rather than the fact of being disabled. And I'd like to focus on this third aim because clearly disability and the long-term health issues affect many people across the United Kingdom, in fact over 12 million people currently under the Equality Act definition. And disability will impact on each one of those 12 million people in an individual and very specific way. And we know that many disabled people are, of course, able to fully participate, work, and have no or very modest additional costs. But we also know that for others, they, of course, experience great barriers, and many disabled people or non-disabled people simply do not have. So let's be clear, it is right that support through the social security system is targeted, and that targeted support is there to help them by targeting that support and by targeting the needs and defects rather than primarily a diagnosis or condition. And this is the approach taken for all disability benefit issues. It is in this context that the government has approached its commitment to devolving disability benefits to the Scottish Parliament, and by setting out the broad parameters to the benefits, we confer legislative competence for a defined policy area in such a way that allows the Scottish Parliament to determine how they achieve this and doesn't tie them to using existing rules and criteria. And in the spirit of this, our approach has not been to take the seemingly more obvious route of somehow mimicking the existing legislative provisions or providing a formulation which sets out absolute boundaries. Our view is that either of these approaches could put unnecessary restrictions in place on the Scottish Parliament. Nevertheless, our approach must reflect the benefits as they stand, including, importantly, the fact that they contain exceptions, both to allow entitlement and to restrict payment where necessary. But I would like to put the emphasis that these provisions provide ample flexibility and allow for the Scottish Parliament to legislate in ways which could allow for a myriad of outcomes for people who would otherwise not meet the more general provisions. I will briefly give way.
The Minister has said that the Government doesn't want to place unnecessary restrictions on the Scottish Parliament. That's just, as you said, how the Government are approaching the legislation. Which of the amendments that honourable members have spoken to would put restrictions on the Scottish Parliament?
This is the definition, and importantly, with regards to the definition, we want to ensure that, as I've already said, it provides ample flexibility to the Scottish Parliament to legislate in ways which would allow for a range of outcomes for people who would not otherwise meet particular provisions. Mr Chairman, moving on to Amendment 48, which relates to carers' benefits. As with the disability benefits, the approach we have taken is to describe the key features of the existing carers' allowance benefit, but the clause does not restrict the Scottish Parliament to follow in all the detailed features in the current carers' allowance. For example, they will not be restricted to making a benefit payment to only one carer in respect of each disabled person. Taken together with existing devolved powers in areas such as social care, the clause ensures that the Scottish Parliament will have the powers to set out the way in which support is provided for carers. This includes the rate at which it is paid, whether it is paid as a benefit or whether support is provided in some other way. There is also a very broad definition of the disabled person in respect to whom carers' benefit can be paid, and Amendment 48 would extend the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament still further, allowing them to provide carers' benefit for children under 16, people in full-time education or those who are gainfully employed. Let me take each of these in turn and explain why we do not consider there is a case for the exception to be expanded in this way. For those under 16 are not normally supported by the benefit system, rather they're supported by guardians, local authorities, parents, and this is a long-standing principle of the social security system. In respect of not gainfully employed, carers' allowance is designed as a form of recognition of those whose opportunities to work are limited because of the time they dedicate to caring duties. Therefore, there needs to be a threshold to judge whether the claimant is employment or not. The reference to gainful employment is a means of doing so. Those in full-time education are not normally supported by the benefit system, rather they're supported by the educational maintenance system through its system of loans and grants. This clause allows the Scottish Parliament to decide the detail of whose carers' benefits are paid, how much they are paid and what eligibility criteria should be. We believe the parameters around the definition of relevant carer are appropriate ones that reflect some long-standing principles about the purpose of carers' benefits. Now, with regards to I will briefly give way.
Grateful to the Minister, and she has given the explanation for why that justification is in there for the restriction of the definition of carers. But if the Scottish Parliament has the full power to set up any new devolved benefit or top up any reserve benefit, why shouldn't it be up to the Scottish Parliament to decide their own definition for carers? It shouldn't affect the provisions in the bill.
Well, as I've said already, this clause allows the Scottish Parliament to decide the detail of whose carers' benefits are paid to. I really want to make progress because there are many other points that I need to come to as well. With regards to the Honourable Lady for Banff and Buchan, she spoke about carers, and I would just like to make the point that...
Before we do that,
I will briefly give way.
I think there is some problem with ministers getting to the House as well. So if I can just ask her, how will the block grant be adjusted to both take into account the extra welfare responsibilities and the extra revenues? Because it's a rather important point to understand the significance of these clauses.
I'd say to the Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman, that this is subject to the discussions that are taking place with regards to the fiscal framework. If I can just go back to the point about carers, there was a debate about carers, and in particular I would like to put on record that obviously we recognise and appreciate the vital contribution made by informal carers who provide tremendous support to relatives, parents, family members, and I think everybody in this House recognise that. Now, if I can briefly, I've got a lot to cover, so if I can briefly touch on Amendment 115, which relates to powers being devolved in respect to the provision of the Regulated Social Fund, which is also touched. Clause 20 gives the Scottish Parliament legislative competence in relation to support currently provided by a number of reserved benefits, funeral payments, maternity grants. They were briefly touched on in the debate. As with our approach to disability and carers benefits, the clause does not simply devolve the existing benefits themselves, but rather the subject matter of the benefits. This gives the Scottish Parliament wide-ranging powers to make their own provision for the areas covered in these particular benefits. I would briefly like to touch on the Honourable Gentleman is not in his place, but Amendments 132 and 117. The Government has made significant changes to these clauses since they were first published in draft in January, and having listened to the views of the Scottish Government and Parliament and key stakeholders, the bill now includes new top-up provisions at clause 21, and while some provisions relating to discretionary housing payments that people felt unnecessarily constrained the powers being devolved have been removed. The Scottish, together, clauses 21 and 23 will give the Scottish Parliament significant powers to legislate for discretionary payments to people in Scotland, whether they be to top up a reserve benefit or provide assistance to meet short-term needs, allowing the Scottish Government to provide additional money to people and above that provided by the UK Government. I did just want to touch on the points it was made by members on the opposite benches just briefly about the comments on welfare reforms and tax credits. I should just point out, of course, that next week we have my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will be bringing his budget to the House, and there'll be further discussions around that, of course, where other measures will be highlighted. But also the Honourable Member for Banff and Buchan, she mentioned in particular the letter in the Herald today as well, and she spoke about children. I do want to get on the record as well, the proportion of children in poverty is at its lowest level since the mid-80s, and with regards to our welfare reform, if I could make the point, with regards to the short discussion that was touched on welfare reform, this government is absolutely committed to not just reforming welfare, but supporting families that need support to get into work. And with regards to poverty, the best route out of poverty is to work. And, I make no apology for all our efforts to raise incomes by expanding our employment opportunities. We will, of course, have a debate in another group later on this afternoon with regards to employment opportunities. And because we're short on time, I would like to touch on that later on. But there was also, the point was made about sanctions and conditionality. Conditionality is an important feature of our welfare system. And, of course, I note that both the Labour Party and the SNP have always stated that they themselves agree that conditionality should be in the system. And with regards to sanctions, there was a brief debate as well on sanctions. And I would again like to put on record that there has been an independent review on sanctions, which was undertaken by, it is the Oakley Review. I would like to say that the government has accepted all the recommendations as highlighted by the Oakley Review and have already implemented a number of provisions, and this includes improvements to the hardship payments process as well. I will very briefly, as she recognises...
Right, that the Oakley report made a number of recommendations in relation to process. But in terms of the real concerns of the Select Committee, which were about whether sanctions were being fairly and proportionately applied, Oakley did not and was not asked to address that. What can she say in relation to the recommendations of the Select Committee in terms of problems about the actual substance of the way in which sanctions are operated?
With regards to this point, I mean, this is something, obviously, and I'm aware of the report that was made to the Select Committee. The Department itself will put on record its own views on this. But I do, for the purpose of this debate, I do want to emphasise, and particularly for the party members on the opposite benches there, who previously have stood up and brought cases around sanctions to the House, I would urge them to write to me directly with specific cases and points that they wish to make. Now, I'm not going to give way because we are running out of time. There are other amendments that have been brought up here as well. But with regards to, I know that we've had a debate on discretionary payments around clause 23 as well. I do just want to make a point that on discretionary payments, I can assure the House that clause 23, as drafted, does not limit the existing competence of the Scottish Parliament and would not prevent discretionary payments being made to people in families under exceptional pressure. And I did just want to make that point. Now, finally, Mr Corsby, I would like to turn to clause 31, which would insert a new exception to the Social Security Reservation in the Scotland Act 1988. This new exception seeks to give the Scottish Parliament the power to create new benefits. As set out at second reading and in our discussion with the Scottish Government, the Government agrees with the principle in the Smith Commission agreement that the Scottish Parliament should be able to create new benefits. I want to make my point. No, because I've taken interventions and I want to make my point and time is running out. We believe...
Point of order. The Minister has repeatedly said she cannot respond to the House because time is short. We've got until 7 o'clock.
Let me just make the point as well. We have other groups of amendments to discuss this afternoon. And this is a discussion. I'll very happily have the discussion. And I will come to some of these points later in the other... It's no excuse. Let me just say that. It is no excuse to believe. If I may continue, Mr Corsby, yes. We believe that they can already do this in terms of creating new benefits, either under existing powers or under the powers being devolved by this bill. The Smith Commission was very clear about what welfare powers were to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and the bill delivers those welfare powers in a way which allows the Scottish Parliament to replace those benefits and payments for which the powers are being devolved. In respect to the areas of devolved responsibility outside of welfare, we believe the Scottish Parliament has the powers to provide financial assistance to people in devolved areas, and they currently do so in some areas already. We do not consider that the Social Security Reservation prevents the Scottish Parliament from providing such financial assistance. This proposed new exception would give the Scottish Parliament the competence to legislate to create new benefits in any area other than the ones where reserve powers existed on the 28th of May 2015, on the date in which the bill was introduced. This would flip the Social Security Reservation on its head. As it's such, this would not provide the new power to create benefits in devolved areas of responsibilities, so much as devolve further areas of responsibility to the Scottish Parliament, which is not what the Smith Commission agreement called for. Undermining the Social Security Reservation in this way would simply limit the freedom of the UK Parliament in relation to the new introduction of welfare benefits or making changes to existing reserve benefits in the future. Mr Corsby, we are about to discuss many other clauses and other groupings this afternoon. I would happily come on to some of these other points in the discussion that we will be having, but at this stage, Mr Corsby, I would urge honourable members to withdraw these amendments.
Ian Murray.
Well, I appreciate the Minister has come to the dispatch box to try and respond to her amendments, but slightly disappointed she's used the excuse of restricted time. We have another 5 hours left in this debate with only two more groups of amendments to go forward. As I did say at the end of my initial contribution, Mr Cosby, that if the Government was to accept any amendments at all in the entirety of the Scotland Bill, it would be very useful if they were to accept new Clause 31, because what that would do, quite clearly, is to give the Scottish Parliament the power to set up any new benefit in a devolved area and top up any benefit in the reserved area. That gives them a wide-ranging power to be able to design a system of welfare in Scotland that fits the needs of the Scottish people. So that's incredibly important. So I would like to push new Clause 31 to a vote later this evening when we get to the end of this particular section. But in the meantime, I'd like to seek the will of the House on amendment number 128 and number 46, if possible. 48, sorry, 128 and 46. 48.
The question is that Amendment 128 be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Order.
The ayes to the right, 252. The noes to the left, 312.
The ayes to the right, 252. The noes to the left, 312. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. .48. I call Ian Murray to move formally. The question is that the amendment be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobby. Have it. Unlock. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 258. The noes to the left, 314.
The ayes to the right, 258. The noes to the left, 314. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock.